Hi, guys. Welcome to our podcast. We are going to be discussing about Limitless. The Federal Reserve takes on a new age of crisis, and we are joined here today with Matthew Higa, Jacob Gorokhovsky, and Tristan Buck, and we will be discussing Chapter 13, the Fed. Now, before we get on that, the book, the book Limitless, the Federal Reserve takes on a new age of crisis, talks about the tension between the central bank's unprecedented emergency actions and the desire to return to a more restrained traditional stance, meaning that for this chapter, we are discussing about how the federal government would work on helping the economy. And this discusses about the different topics on how the federal government would help with supporting Nunchin's view on view on the wa- view on different topics on the economy and with how would it help with the people who are struggling, those that are in impoverished areas. But today, um, for the first part of of our project, we will be discussing how the how the chapter opens up um, with a Fed. So this chapter covers the federal government, which has just unleashed unprecedented power in 2020, and now we're going to see the consequences about their actions and roles relating to the problem and issues that we had today. So, the Florida tourism collapsed during COVID, and it serves as the human anchor of this chapter. The Main Street Lending Program, which was designed to was meant to help small and mid-sized businesses, and the Mango's Tropical Cafe, for example, um, shows that it's how businesses actually um, utilized with their role in supporting the people's needs. Um, but it did use the program that was supported by the federal government. So we're going to be also discussing about why the programs underperformed, um, using their strict eligibility criteria and the bank's reluctance to take on credit risk, um, lead to widespread skepticism about whether it really worked, um, which is the problems occurred, um, for the people of small businesses like the Mango Tropical Cafe, for example. Um, then for a handoff line, um, what some examples and quotations we could also add would be, but while businesses on Main Street were wrestling with a Fed's loan program, a much bigger fight was brewing in Washington over what the Fed should even be allowed to do. And this quotation shows that with the businesses operating on Main Street.
Thanks, Sean. So while small businesses in Florida were struggling with the Main Street program, a much bigger fight was breaking out in Washington. Not over how the Fed should help, but whether it should have this much power at all. Now, that's the heart of Chapter 13. Smilek's argument in 2020, the Fed proved its powers were essentially limitless. And that's exactly what triggered Congress to start restraining it. The CARES Act created Congressional Oversight Commission to monitor the Fed and Treasury, and it became a microcosm of a much bigger debate. Progressives like Bharat Ramamurti argued that the Fed wasn't going far enough. If it can conjure trillions to backstop corporate bond markets, which mostly helps big companies and wealth investors, why not use the same power for struggling cities and workers? Now, conservatives like Pat Toomey argued the opposite. His view was that the Fed had crossed from monetary policy, managing rates and liquidity, to fiscal policy, which is Congress's job. This is the classic tension between liquidity support and credit allocation. Liquidity support keeps markets functioning. Credit allocation decides who gets the money. Central banks traditionally do the first and avoid the second. In 2020, the Fed unmistakably did both. Then, in November 2020, after Biden wins, Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin shocks people. He announces that he's letting the Fed's emergency facilities expire and clawing back the unused CARES Act money. Here's why that matters mechanically. So under Section 13, the Fed can lend in emergencies, but it needs Treasury to put up money to absorb potential losses. Pull that backstop and the facility can't really operate. Powell publicly published back, rare for a Fed chair. Democrats called it economic sabotage. Mnuchin said he was following Congress's original intent. Either way, the most powerful crisis tool the Fed had ever built were being dismantled right before the new administration took office. In December, relief negotiations Toomey published permanently.
Hi, my name's Tristan, and I'll be going over the technocratic trap. So this section looks into the irony of the Fed's success, and because the Fed's wonky technocrats were so much more efficient than the politically accountable Congress, they inadvertently became the only functioning part of the government, which led to a dangerous over-reliance on the central bank. So the two key mechanisms that I'll be going over is psychological backstopping and forward guidance. So psychological backstopping was the soothing effect of the Fed's presence. Often the Fed doesn't even need to lend money. They just announce a program which is enough to stop the panic. So for forward guidance, keeping rates at zero and committing to massive bond purchases, about $120 billion per month, would provide a limbo state of stability while politicians would fight and bicker. So our one worked example is by mid-2020, the macro recovery appeared miraculous. The U.S. labor market saw a record 8.3 million hires in May 2020, and a sharp bounce back from 3.9 million in April. However, this masked a micro disaster, and because of this, while hiring was up, global poverty rates were undergoing a reversal of fortune. So the World Bank estimated that between 88 million and 115 million people were pushed into extreme poverty in 2020 due to the pandemic. So one common misconception that many people have is that they often think that the Fed has the tools to solve any economic crisis, including pandemics. So in reality, the Fed's tools are blunt, and it can provide liquidity, but cannot provide relief in the way that stimulus checks can. As the chapter concludes, the need for government spending is often more intense and better targeted than the need for Fed support. So, two takeaways that you can get from this is that success breeds resentment and the winter limbo. So, success breeds resentment is basically the Fed's ability to act out of panic better than the Congress, which is exactly why politicians like Pat Toomey moved to restrain them. They feared the Fed was becoming too powerful to control the people. So the winter limbo is relying on a central bank to bridge a year-long clawback from the abyss, as a bandage, not a cure. Eventually, the politically accountable branches must take over in the end. So the reason why this split works is part 1 is concrete, narrative, easy to make, engaging with the Florida small business angle. It's a good opener material. Part 2 is the analytical payoff with the political conflict and the chapter's thesis. Part 3 challenges the listener to think about what a central bank should be. And Part 4 focuses on the big picture, connecting the 2020 crisis to the broader problem of a dysfunctional government relying on an unelected technocracy to save the day. This 4-part structure creates a perfect narrative arc. Each part is roughly 4 to 5 minutes.
The Fed from restarting those facilities or anything similar, definitely defined broadly, that would gut the Fed's 13 authority. The compromise narrowed it. The Fed couldn't reopen those exact facilities, but its broader emergency lending power survived. Politically, a draw. Institutionally, a real shot across the bow. So that's why the chapter is called A Fed Restrained, not A Fed Defeated. The irony Smilek lands on is this. A Fed showed it could do almost anything in 2020, and that's precisely why Congress started asking whether it should. And it sets up the next test, because by 2021 inflation is rising, and the same Fed that played rescuer is about to flip roles entirely and become the economy's disciplinarian. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Today, we will be covering Chapter 13, Part 3 of Limitless. The Federal Reserve Takes on a New Age of Crisis by Gianna Smollett. And basically, the core idea is that the Federal Reserve has gone from a lender of last resort, saving banks from collapse, to a lender of first resort, which proactively directs credit to non-financial sectors. And this highlights the tension between the Fed's transitional role as a neutral market stabilizer and its new role as an arbiter of which businesses and municipalities are worthy of survival. So basically, their job was that if a banking system was on fire, they would show up as a firefighter to help save the day. But in 2020, that changed. The Fed moved from being lender of last resort to lender of first resort. Instead of just saving banks, it started to save everyone, from city governments to a local shop on the corner. The shift sparked a massive debate. Should a group of unelected bankers really be the ones deciding which parts of the economy are worthy of survival? So the first mechanism is loans with no strings attached. Basically, the Fed was acting more like a transitional leader. They started using term manipulation, which means that they weren't just setting interest rates. They were adding strings to the money. For example, they could cap how much executives got paid or restrict stock buybacks for companies for taking loans. They were essentially using the credit to force specific social outcomes, trying to ensure inclusive growth rather than just market stability. The first mechanism is the emergency power button. How are they able to do this? They hit a legislative emergency power button, known as Section 13(3). This gave the Fed the power to bypass the banks and lend money directly to specific sectors. For the first time, the Fed wasn't just managing the money supply. They were dictating where that money went, specifically targeting local governments and mid-sized businesses that usually never dealt with the Fed. So my worked example is use World Bank data. While the Fed provided liquidity, the World Bank data reveals that there's actually a solvency gap that explains why the programs like Main Street struggled. Basically, small and medium enterprises were 8% more likely to temporarily shut down than large firms during the 2020 shock. And the World Bank found that while interest rates were at record lows, the majority of small and medium-sized enterprises did not turn to banks for loans because their cash drained faster than they could borrow it. They needed grants, basically income, not loans. The high-income economies, in high-income economies like the US and Europe, 80% of firms expected public aid to survive. But the Fed's programs were loans that added to debt and stressed the balance sheets. This data illustrates why Main Street program underperformed. The Fed was offering a liquidity solution to a solvency crisis. So one common misconception about this is that the Fed's emergency programs are a form of taxpayer spending that increase the national deficit. That's actually not true. These programs are actually backstops. As the text notes, the Congressional Budget Office doesn't count this money as an expense because the funds are only used if the loans go sour. Otherwise, the money is just an insurance policy that often costs the nation nothing. So one of two key takeaways to understand about this part of the chapter is that independence is fragile. When the Fed starts choosing winners, like specific cities or business sectors, it loses its shield of political neutrality. The second key takeaway is that this is a slippery slope. If the Fed becomes the lender of first resort, it risks distorting the market pricing and becomes a permanent crutch for a divided Congress. In short, the Fed saved the economy in 2020, but in doing so, they may have changed the definition of a central bank forever.